Hey, what's up? I'm Robert. I'm one of the people who makes Hydrogen ML, and today we're talking about flow maps and consistency maps for WarpFusion. So if you've been using WarpFusion, you might have seen these kind of things that get generated. They're very colorful, or these things which are less colorful but honestly more important. You might have wondered kind of what's going on. So in this video, we're going to talk not only about what these two things are, like what the different colors here mean, but we're also going to talk about all of these different consistency settings, like, misconsistency weight, edge consistency width, consistency blur, dilate, sort of really try to help you understand at a fundamental level what is going on, how is WarpFusion calculating these things and how you can use them to get better generations. Quick note on software. We're using Hydrogen, which is like an AI video editing website, supports a bunch of techniques. And today we're going to be looking at, I guess, obviously the WarpFusion technique. WarpFusion is this awesome notebook from this guy named Alex. It's open source. He's put a ton of work into it. And if you find yourself using the WarpFusion technique a lot, either in the notebook or via Hydrogen, then you should definitely support Alex on his Patreon and check out his Discord. Then a quick note on GPUs. If you have a local GPU that's good enough to run this stuff, then you can just download this Docker container, type in your computer's IP here, and do the whole thing for free. If you're like me, and unfortunately you have a Mac without a good GPU, then you can use Hydrogen's like cloud GPUs. They're very fast, and we give everyone like $10 in free credits. I'll start by creating a new project, and then we're going to use this clip of a car in Tokyo that I've been using for my testing recently. Hydrogen will sort of upload and then split the video into frames for us. And then, of course, we'll be using the WarpFusion backend. And here's the video that we're looking at. It's just a car sort of driving around in the night in Tokyo. So we'll be using some pretty standard settings. For this, why don't we say like a car driving at night, Tokyo, rain and bright colors. And then for the negative prompts, why don't we stick with just blurry and unfocused. Then, because there's no people in this clip, we won't be using the OpenPose control net. And for models, I prefer to use Dreamsheeper 8. So with that, we can start generating. Okay, excellent. So it looks like Hydrogen has finished generating the flow maps, which we can see here, and also the consistency maps, which we can see here, and has started to generate our output video. So we're going to stop it because we don't care about the output video for now, and we're just going to look at these flow maps. The deal with flow maps is actually pretty simple. It's for each pixel, the color is a direction, and the brightness is how much the pixel moved in that direction. And the directions are mapped on one of these color wheels. So for example, you can see that like red and green are at like roughly a 45 degree angle from each other. And here you can see the green pixels are moving mostly this way, and the red pixels presumably are moving either mostly this way or mostly this way. So because the car frame over frame is moving to the right, then you can see like each of the pixels in the car all have the same color because they're all moving together. Now that we've taken a look at these very pretty flow maps, let's take a look at the consistency maps. So these are a bit uglier and harder to understand, but they're ultimately much closer to what WarpFusion needs to use to generate frames. So I think this is actually a pretty solid, I think this is actually a pretty good consistency map to kind of analyze. And why don't we grab it so we can kind of mark it up. So you'll notice that there's three main colors here. They are yellow, cyan, and magenta. And each of these indicates a different kind of inconsistency in the underlying frame. So the easiest one to start with is the yellow. So the yellow shows up wherever there was an edge in the original flow map. So here, for example, we can see, there's pretty clearly an edge here. We go from blue, like moving this way to the right on bottom, and then there's red, which is not really moving on top. And sure enough, if we look at the consistency map, we'll see, yep, like here's the same yellow color indicating an edge between two different moving bodies on the flow map. So yellow is actually a pretty easy color to understand. You should be getting it between different moving bodies. Now, a slightly harder color to understand is this cyan. So the deal here is, imagine your Warp Fusion, right? And you're watching this car video, and the car is kind of moving to the right. And as the car moves to the right, there's a certain group of pixels which become exposed, which were not previously in the image. So, maybe this pixel right here just goes this way a little bit because the car is moving. But the pixel that's right here, like right emerging from behind the car, wasn't anywhere in the previous frame. Like it just got exposed. And so the way that we indicate that kind of pixel in the consistency map is with this cyan color. So you'll see that the cyan kind of follows the car as it moves, and that should be what you expect because that's where new pixels are getting exposed. Okay, the last color that we need to talk about is the magenta color. So this one is a bit rarer. You have to kind of look for it, but all right, it seems like here is like a pretty clear example of what's going on. And so this magenta color happens when the pixel that like would take up this space came from off screen. So what does that mean? It's like, looking here, right? This pixel right here, like the corner of the brake light, where was it in the previous frame? The answer was it was nowhere. It was like off here. And so if you look at the consistency maps, you'll see that this edge of the car has magenta. Now, the reason it looks blue is that this kind of dark blue color is what you get when you mix like magenta and cyan. So you can think of this dark blue as being both cyan in the sense that it's like newly exposed and magenta in the sense that it came from off screen. Now that we've looked at the flow maps and the consistency maps, let's look at why Warp Fusion needs to generate these things. Like, what does Warp Fusion use consistency maps for? So the answer is, if you go to control nets, you can see here there's this in-painting control net, and it's just like normal. You can turn it on and off. You can increase or decrease its duration and weight. And if you look at what this thing actually does, it generates, so here's the beginning of the video that Warp Fusion has generated, and here is the in-painting control net sort of reference image. So you'll notice here that there are all these parts of the image that are blacked out. And the parts that are blacked out are basically the parts that we're suggesting to Stable Diffusion that it should like reimagine, sort of generate. On the other hand, something like this car, we don't really want to reimagine a new car here. We just want to take this car and move it, 3 pixels to the right or whatever it is. And so the way that we decide which color should get blacked out is by the consistency map. Like here, for example, you can see that this part is like not white and this part is not white. And sure enough, if we look at the corresponding in-painting control net, where did it go? We can see like here is kind of the painted out version of that. All right, so now that we understand broadly what consistency maps are and what they're used for in Warp Fusion, why don't we take a look at some of the many settings you can use to play with them. So if we take a look here, we can search for our consistency settings. And the first 3 we're going to look at are mist consistency weight, overshoot consistency weight, and edges consistency weight. And these 3 correspond to the 3 colors that we've looked at previously, where edges is yellow, mist is cyan, and overshoot is magenta. So for example, let's say that we have, like for example, in this frame, we have lots of yellow from the consistency map. But if we actually look at what happened in the video, it seems like not that much has changed. And so in fact, here we may want to say, do not include, although there's a lot of yellow, we don't actually want to black out much of the frame. So the way we can do that is by decreasing the weight for the edges consistency from 1 maybe to like 0.1 or something, or we can even do 0 to prove the point. And so what this is going to do is, if we go back and run WarpFusion, and we'll need to give it a second to sort of regenerate our diffused images. Oh, okay. So we've now generated the first few frames of our diffusion map, or of our diffusion. And if we scroll in here, we'll sort of see like, okay, here is a frame where there was originally a bunch of yellow in the consistency map, but when we actually watch the original video, it looks kind of misplaced. It seems like maybe there were more edges, like the edge detector picked up more edges in this frame than actually existed. So because we set the edges consistency weight to 0, this is controlling how much of the yellow stuff comes into the in-painting control net. We can see actually like there's nearly nothing blacked out. So lots of yellow here. We used to have lots of black here where stable diffusion was supposed to reimagine something to fill the space, but now we're mostly keeping the old image. So that's how you can use these 3 sliders. You can use them basically if you look at your consistency map and you see that something looks a bit off, like, you have these frames with kind of lots of yellow, but in fact, when you look at the video, it's very consistent. You can turn down the weight for that part of the diffusion run. Okay, so this video is a little bit dark, and so it's a little bit hard to see the in-painting like black strokes. So we're actually going to upload a new video. We're just going to use this like 2-second clip from Gangnam Style. You might even recognize it. It's just this guy kind of walking around with this car. But if we again go to the WarpFusion backend and then generate some flow maps, you will notice that they're just much more interesting and easier to see. Okay, so once again, we can see that WarpFusion has generated some consistency maps and, some flow maps and some consistency maps. And hopefully now you can get a clearer sense of what the in-painting looks like, where anything that had a color here is getting blacked out here. Okay, and then also once again, you can see, for example, here, the guy in the yellow suit is moving sort of backwards relative to the stuff behind him. So new pixels are being exposed like right around his suit. And as expected, we see the blue consistency map colors. Okay, so now we're going to look at some more settings. In particular, we're going to look at edge consistency width. So what does edge consistency width do? Well, it relates to how we detect these yellow edges. And the answer is like WarpFusion does it with this thing called the Sobel filter. And this seems really complicated, but it's actually not complicated at all. Basically, you can imagine that the image is like some grid of numbers, right? Maybe 100 are dark pixels and 200 are brighter pixels. And then we have a little like grid like this. It's called a kernel. And we slide it across the image. And at every point, we multiply all of the numbers in the kernel with the numbers that it overlaps in the image. So for example, here, the very first value, we're going to multiply this 100 by 0, these two also by 0, this by -1, this by -2, this by -1, and these 200s by 1, 2, and 1. So you can see when we add that all up, we're going to get 400. And basically what this kernel does is anywhere where on one side of the kernel it's dark and on the other side of the kernel it's bright, it's going to have a high value. On the other hand, anywhere where like let's say that the image were all 100s, so there were like no edges, then it would be minus 400 on this side and plus 400 on this side, so the sum would come out to 0. So basically, as you slide this thing along the main image, it produces a high value where there are edges and a low value where it's flat. And so getting back to what edge consistency width does, it sets the width of the Sobel filter. So the smaller this number is, the more it's going to detect like local edges, like, very sort of small, fine grained edges. On the other hand, the bigger it is, the more it's going to detect like sort of gentler edges, like larger gradients, basically. Now we're going to look at the consistency blur and consistency dilate settings. So what these settings do is, it's sort of right in the name. Blur basically takes the consistency map and applies a Gaussian blur of width, whatever you put here. So for example, if you put something like 10, then this cyan will get blurred to be very wide, but less, it will have like less intensity. One important thing to know is that these are applied when the consistency maps are loaded back in. So even if you set something like consistency blur to 10, you won't see it here. You'll only be able to notice it in the inpainting, like down here. So the thing that dilate does is dilate just increases the width of the various tracks here. So like if you have a small dot and you apply dilate, now you have a big dot. Or if you have a thin line and you apply dilate, now you have a big line. So if we just set dilate to maybe like 30 and blur to 10 and rerun the generation, you'll see sort of exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so now if we stop our diffusion run, we can see we have a couple of frames, and as expected, all of the edges have gotten very wide. And so the thing that you expect if you do a run like this is that, because everything under the inpainting is what we're asking our stable diffusion to sort of reimagine, then on every frame, the image is changing a lot. So you can basically imagine that the way you should think about these settings, consistency blur and consistency dilate, is if when people move, for example, not enough stuff around their edges is getting reimagined, like there are artifacts from their edges kind of lying around, then probably you should increase consistency blur and or consistency dilate. On the other hand, if the edges are changing too much, like, someone is kind of standing still and, stuff on the like wide side of their edges is changing, then you should be decreasing consistency blur and consistency dilate, which will basically tell Stable Diffusion like, hey, use more of the previous frame and cover up less of it. So I hope you enjoyed this explanation of the flow maps and the consistency maps and the different colors in the consistency maps and sort of the in-painting control net and all the different consistency settings and how all this stuff fits together in WarpFusion. In this tutorial, we're using Hydrogen, which is like a front-end interface. You can get it at hydrogenml.com. And the backends, Hydrogen supports many backends. In this case, we're using the WarpFusion backends, and it's made by this guy called Alex backwards. So if you think WarpFusion is cool, you should support Alex and join his Discord. And if you're interested in sort of keeping up with Hydrogen, you can also join our Discord at hydrogenml.com. Thanks, and good luck warping.